Our next presenter is John Creswell, who's a professor of educational psychology at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. He's authored many books and articles on mixed methods research, qualitative methodology, and research design. His newest book is a SAGE book called A Concise Introduction to Mixed Methods Research, and he's also the founding co-editor of the SAGE Journal of Mixed Methods Research. Among his many accolades and honors include working with the National Institutes of Health to develop best practices for mixed methods research, to being the president of the Mixed Methods International Research Association, and as well the director of the Mixed Methods Academy at the University of Nebraska. I can say from my little corner of political science that if I had $1 for every article or dissertation that wants to use mixed methods, I'd be retired and somewhere else today perhaps. So it's a really a wonderful thing to welcome an expert in this area. Please welcome John Creswell.
Well, thank you, John. Very nice. Sarah, it's my pleasure to be here. Genevieve's done a great job organizing this. My editor and publisher, Vicki Knight, is somewhere here in the audience. Vicki Knight and Blaze, it's good to see you again here. Yesterday I flew in, and the senator from Nebraska wanted to come to this event. Deb Fisher, Senator Deb Fisher, and she said she couldn't come, so she said, why don't you bring John over to my office? So I spent yesterday afternoon visiting with my senator. She walks into the room. She'd obviously had a very busy day. She was kind of frowning a little bit, and she opens up with this question: well, what can you do? What can I do for you today? Which is probably a pretty typical question. And I go, well, really nothing. I'm just here for the SAGE celebration of their 50th anniversary. I'm just going to have fun for the next couple of days. And by the end of our session, she was smiling and laughing, and I was able to put in a little plug for Mixed Methods and for SAGE. I want you to think for a moment about what a researcher might look like and what he or she might be doing. A researcher. So this might be a person in a broad brim hat walking through the jungles as an anthropologist might be doing, right? Or it might be somebody in a laboratory in a white coat, like Thomas Edison, experimenting with all these different materials that could go into the generation of the light bulb. It might be a student in the computer lab crunching the data. So here's the message I want to give you today, that we're all very close to research. When we gather information to understand this world that we're in, we are gathering both numbers and statistics and the stories of people. So stories and numbers. And the research methods that I do will put those two together. Let me illustrate. I'm going to take you back to 2 years ago, just about this time. The Boston bombing, the bombing at the Boston Marathon. Now, you can look at the numbers and statistics about the Boston Marathon. For example, there were about 23,000 runners that day in the Boston Marathon. Over $805,000 in prize money. There were 71 wheelchair and 52 wheelchair contestants. The bombing went off at 2:50 in the afternoon, killing 3 people and wounding 170. And you know, they took these wounded people around to the different hospitals in Boston. Brigham and Women's Hospital, 31 people. Mass General, 31. Boston Medical, 23. Beth Israel, 21. Boston Children, there were 10, ages 2 to 12, that went to that hospital. You may also know that the first responders that day were some doctors that I was working with over at the Harvard Humanitarian Institute. They were the first responders out to the hospitals. Of course, these are people that are going around the world and responding very quickly to medical crises. And it was written up in the Boston paper how these medical doctors from the Harvard Humanitarian Institute really helped save lives because they were out there immediately. Now, I've got to tell you about myself here. I was at mile marker number 23. That morning, I decided not to go down to the finish line, fortunately. And at this mile marker 23, it was at a large intersection. There must have been 1,000 people there. And they had these large speakers that were blasting music. YMCA was one of the songs. And another one was Sweet Caroline. And as these runners walked or ran past us, they actually started smiling at this 23-mile marker. You know, this is when they're very, very tired. They were smiling, they were laughing. We actually uplifted their spirits. And then a little bit later, I was standing at the same spot. And these individuals were walking past me. What happened was they were turned around at mile marker 24 and told to go back. And then they were given blankets. And so these people were walking past me in shock with their heads down, trying to understand this tragedy. Now, what I've just given you is a mixed methods research rendering of the Boston Marathon event. First, I started with the numbers, and then I told my personal story. Now, if you had just heard my personal story, you may not know about the number of runners and the prize money. If I had told you about the numbers, you may not have gotten the personal story. So what I'm going to do now is put the numbers together with the stories in a new form of research called mixed methods research. And I think you'll see how this is very close to your everyday experience. Turn on CNN or any TV news broadcast, and you will get both the numbers and stories about the earthquake in Kathmandu, Nepal, you know, where they're interviewing people that have survived, and they're also giving you the statistics, the numbers and statistics. When you go into your doctor's office, I want you to think about getting the numbers in terms of the values of your cholesterol count, as well as that doctor asking you about what you've eaten. Tell us the story of it. A mixed methods rendering. The next time you go to a sporting event, be aware that often there is a play-by-play, numbers-oriented commentator. And seated right next to this person is a person often called the color commentator that's telling the stories. It's a mixed methods broadcast of this sporting event. Or an example that I used at the National Music Therapy Conference last November. When you play music, you're doing a mixed methods rendering. For example, we all know how to count when we play the piano, the rhythm, the numbers. But we also know it's important to phrase our notes within measures. We're telling the story. So music, as it's performed, is a mixed methods rendering. Developing documentaries. We have a lot of excellent documentaries. I've been working with a friend of mine who has an award-winning documentary out about the Turkish people in Germany. He begins by relating the numbers of the Turkish people living in the country and some of the economic conditions using numbers. And then he goes into some of the stories that people told us. He's doing a mixed methods documentary. And even as John started his introduction today talking about same-sex marriage, he said, you know, there are people doing the surveys, and then you said there are real-world gatherings. So the stories as well as the numbers to understand same-sex marriage. It's in our everyday lives, isn't it? This idea of putting together numbers and stories is the research methods called mixed methods research that I've been working on with SAGE for almost 20 years. There was a mathematician in South Africa that said, here's what mixed methods is to me. It's two hands coming together, and he stood in front of my workshop and put his hands together like this. The stories and the numbers coming together to tell a complete picture. When we were presenting in Tokyo, Japan on mixed methods about a year ago, one of the participants walked up to the whiteboard and said, here's what mixed methods is to me, and drew an equation. 1 plus 1 equals 3. In other words, the sum of gathering the stories and the numbers is more than just each one individually. It gives us 1 plus 1 equals 3. This is an approach to research that is built on a very simple idea. It started about 1985 to 90. There were 8 people around the world that came to the same conclusion. We were all working independently, that if you put quantitative and qualitative research together, you would have something larger. Some of these individuals were evaluators, sociologists, some were from the health sciences. I was working from the field of education. When I published my first SAGE book in 1994 called Research Design, I had a little chapter in there called Combining Quantitative and Qualitative Research, Combining Numbers and Stories. I got more emails from around the world on that one chapter than any others. I knew I was on to something. So what's happened now is from this very simple idea of putting numbers and stories together has grown a complete way of doing research called mixed methods. And it's expanded since those early days of the 1985 to 1990. The innovations. We now have a mixed methods question. We have diagrams of procedures. We have types of designs. We have ways to write up these stories and these studies. We have webinars. Next week, I'll be giving a webinar across the country to health science researchers on mixed methods. We have online courses in mixed methods research. We have a Facebook page with our national association. We have a Twitter page. I've been developing a new app that would go up on an iPhone to help a person decide what kind of mixed methods design might be used. So what's been happening here is that this mixed methods concept, simple idea that now has developed into a way of doing research, has expanded among disciplines and around the world. I'm going to start with a policy example. I was speaking to the Boston Health Commission. I had all the commissioners across the city in the room talking about mixed methods research, and they were telling me about a survey they had done where they got very confusing and conflicting results. So I could stand up and say, well, why don't you follow that up with some qualitative interviews, some stories? So you see that model, quantitative followed by qualitative. Another example from Boston. We're working on an NIH project with the Bhutanese and the Somali refugees in Boston. We're studying how families cope and how they work with their children that have come to this new country of America to live. In that project, we're starting with interviews, the stories. We want to find out how they're thinking about working with their children in this new community. And then we're going to administer some instruments that might be culturally appropriate. Qualitative stories, followed by quantitative surveys. In the field of family medicine, I'm working now with a project out of NIH that is looking at cardiovascular prevention in 2,000 family medicine practices all across the country. This is a mixed methods project where people are gathering both interview data and survey data to understand how these practices can better address cardiovascular disease. In Bangkok, Thailand, I was speaking to the researchers doing tourism, and there they want to find out how best to enhance tourism within the country, and they're using both surveys, the quantitative numbers, as well as the qualitative stories. In South Africa, I've been working with the researchers studying AIDS that go into the townships. They're looking at the stigmas attached to young women, especially in those small communities. They're gathering both the stories through videotapes as well as the numbers through the surveys. Here back in the United States now, I chaired a commission developing guidelines for NIH on best practices in mixed methods in the health sciences. We put our report up on a website, and within 3 weeks, there were 19,000 hits on that website, making it the most heavily hit website at NIH in recent history. The director of the Office of Behavioral and Social Science Research, which is an office over all of the institutes and the centers at NIH, got up at the end of a workshop on mixed methods and implementation science to say, this is the next methodology of the future for the social, behavioral, and health sciences. That was his closing point. When we founded the Journal of Mixed Methods Research, a SAGE journal in 2007, it obtained an impact score within a record 2 years. And an impact score measures the prestige of a journal. So SAGE's role has been instrumental through all these years. They've started the major journal. They've published my books. I've been told that the book that I wrote with Plano Clark is industry standard. And this is the most recent book I've written. How many authors carried their own books around with them? But I've got to tell you about this book. This is more than just a book. And I'm not trying to promote it here, but I want to put it into the stream of what's developed in terms of mixed methods thinking here in the United States and around the world. I wrote this book in a way that it could be read in 2 to 3 hours, and I can document that. It's a short book, a short read. Why did I do that? I was working at Harvard, and I had a lot of medical doctors in my groups that I was consulting with, and they can't turn to a 400-page book and digest it quickly. They need something to get into the topic very quickly. Furthermore, I asked SAGE to sell this for $20. So it's very inexpensive. It's the same price that my research design book was when it came out in the early 1990s. And furthermore, it's up on a Kindle now. And most importantly, it's a short introduction to this field that is expanding around the world so that it can be translated into many languages, which it's doing right now. And so at a certain point in the evolution of how we do research, sometimes putting together something in a very concise way can help expand interest and help move it out around the world and across the social sciences. So you see, from a very simple idea that's in our everyday experience, putting together stories and numbers, has now expanded a research methodology that we all can understand, right? And it's grown through the strategies that SAGE has helped, through the journals, through the books, through the endorsements, and we now have a new methodology that may well be the wave of the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. When I wrote this book about the 2012 presidential election, I went to Iowa for the caucuses and had dinner one night in a Pizza Ranch restaurant in Altoona, and just so I could go to a Rick Santorum rally. And of all the experiences I had writing that book, I would not trade anything for the chance to have gone to that Pizza Ranch in Altoona, Iowa, if we're only to see the juxtaposition of pizza and a ranch, right, in one restaurant. To me, the stories and the numbers had to come together in just that way.